All right, so today we're diving deep into the Trail of Tears, but like we're not just skimming the surface here.
Right, we're going way beyond the textbook version.
Exactly. We're looking at firsthand accounts, legal battles, the whole 9 yards, stuff you might not have learned in school.
Yeah, it's interesting how we often simplify the Trail of Tears down to just one event, when in reality it took place over decades,
Oh, for sure.
from 1830 to 1850. And it affected the lives of 5 different Native American nations: the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. They were often called the 5 civilized tribes.
5 civilized tribes. See, that's one of those terms that always kind of makes me pause. Like, what does that even mean in this context? And why is it so important for us to understand the Trail of Tears?
You're right to question that term. It's definitely loaded, historically speaking. These tribes, they'd already adopted a lot of European American customs. They were farming, building plantations,
Wow.
and even, sadly, owning slaves. So they weren't exactly living in a way that challenged westward expansion. They were trying to coexist, even assimilate,
Right.
which makes their forced removal all the more tragic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about the land itself. It was about like dismantling a whole society that was trying to play by the rules they were given.
Yeah,
Man, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to this story.
it does.
And then, of course, there's the human cost. I mean, we're talking about estimates of 13,200 to 16,700 deaths.
Yeah.
That's not just migration. That's a horrific loss of life.
It is. And a lot of it was fueled by plain old greed. The discovery of gold on Cherokee land back in 1828, that triggered the Georgia Gold Rush.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, it wasn't just about pushing Native Americans west, it was about pushing them off land that could potentially make people rich.
So this is where Andrew Jackson usually gets painted as the villain, right?
Yeah.
But it sounds like things were already in motion before he even stepped into office.
Exactly. Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, but the stage had been set long before him. This idea of the vanishing Indian,
Right.
this myth that they were just disappearing naturally, that had taken root in American society.
It's almost as if they created this self-fulfilling prophecy to justify their actions, like, oh, they're vanishing anyway. But the truth was way more sinister. They were being pushed out, often violently, and this myth just let people turn a blind eye.
That's exactly it. And that brings us to the Indian Removal Act itself. On paper, it was all about the voluntary exchange of land.
Voluntary. Yeah, I bet those quotes are doing a lot of work there.
Oh, absolutely. Tribes were supposed to give up their ancestral homes for territory west of the Mississippi.
Okay, but I'm guessing Andrew Jackson probably had some, shall we say, persuasive arguments in favor of this voluntary relocation.
Oh, he definitely did. Jackson and lots of other supporters of removal, they claimed this was all in the best interest of Native Americans.
Right.
That they were protecting them from those encroaching settlers. You can even find quotes from Jackson talking about wanting them to, and I'm quoting here, pursue happiness in their own way, as if this forced migration was some act of kindness.
It's amazing how often we see, throughout history, oppression disguised as benevolence.
It's a pattern, isn't it?
It is, but we know how this story unfolds. What were the tribes themselves saying during all of this?
Well, we can actually hear directly from them. Chief Georgia W. Harkins, a Choctaw leader, wrote a farewell letter to the American people.
Wow.
And in it, he says, "We, as Choctaws, rather chose to suffer and be free than live under the degrading influence of laws which our voice could not be heard in their formation."
Chose to suffer and be free. That's incredibly powerful and heartbreaking, really. It speaks to the impossible choice they were given, forced assimilation or forced removal. And even when they tried to fight back through the legal system, well, it didn't always pan out, did it?
No, it didn't. The Cherokee cases, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia and Worcester v. Georgia, they really highlight this tragic reality. In a kind of ironic twist, the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Cherokee.
They did.
They did. They affirmed their right to self-governance and their right to their land.
Wait, hold on. The Supreme Court sided with them, but they were still forced out. How does that even happen?
That's where the real complexities of power come in, right? The limits of the legal system.
Yeah.
Politics.
Right.
The court might have recognized Cherokee sovereignty, but they didn't have a way to actually enforce that ruling. There was no army waiting to back them up.
So it wasn't enough to just win in court. They needed the political will to enforce that win.
Yeah.
And that's where they were ultimately betrayed.
Exactly. Jackson, already dealing with tensions over states' rights, he wasn't about to risk a civil war on this issue.
Wow.
Whether it was personal conviction or just political maneuvering, he chose what he saw as national stability over the rights of the Cherokee.
It's a tough pill to swallow. To know that you're in the right, legally speaking, only to be disregarded for what? Political expediency. That adds another layer of tragedy to this whole story.
It does.
And it just goes to show that a legal victory doesn't always mean justice, especially for marginalized groups facing deeply ingrained prejudice. And then, even after all that, the Cherokee were hit with the Treaty of New Echota.
Right.
That was the final nail in the coffin, wasn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately it was. The Treaty of New Echota, it was signed by a minority faction of the Cherokee, not their elected leaders or the majority of the people.
Oh, wow.
And it became the legal justification for their forced removal.
So not only was their land taken, but it was done under the pretense of a treaty that didn't even represent them.
Yeah.
That's adding insult to injury.
It is. And this wasn't an isolated incident either. Many tribes facing removal were divided.
Yeah.
Some believed accommodation was the only way to survive, while others refused to give up their ancestral homelands.
It's like a recurring theme throughout history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Those in power exploiting divisions within a community to get what they want.
Right.
But knowing all of this, the legal battles, the forced treaties, it makes their eventual journey that much more tragic. What were the conditions actually like on the Trail of Tears?
Try to imagine, being rounded up, given just days to pack your life's possessions, and then forced to march on foot over 1,000 miles to what is now Oklahoma.
Wow.
Many Cherokee families, they made that journey with just the clothes on their backs.
It's hard to even fathom, really, the physical hardship alone. It makes me think of accounts from other forced migrations in history, where people were just driven from their homes with nothing but the hope of survival.
And for the Cherokee, this wasn't just displacement from their homes, right? They were deeply connected to their land,
Yeah.
their sacred sites, their traditions, their whole identity. It was all tied to that land.
So it wasn't just losing property, it was losing a part of themselves.
Exactly.
Did things get any better once they reached Indian territory?
Sadly, no, not really. The Cherokee, when they arrived in present-day Oklahoma, they faced a whole new set of challenges.
Oh, cool.
Rebuilding their lives in a new and often hostile environment. Resources were limited, and the U.S. government was constantly watching them.
It's like the Trail of Tears had this ripple effect,
Yeah.
The hardship didn't stop once they arrived. It impacted those already trying to make a life in Indian territory.
Absolutely. This huge influx of people put a strain on everything. Resources were stretched thin. Competition for land and hunting grounds increased.
Right.
It led to tension and conflict between tribes who had already been displaced.
And on top of all that, the trauma of the journey itself. That must have continued to affect the Cherokee even after they arrived in Oklahoma.
Absolutely. Those divisions we talked about earlier, those didn't just vanish once they crossed the Mississippi. The tensions between those who signed the Treaty of New Echota and those who opposed it.
Right.
It continued to simmer, and in some cases, it boiled over.
What do you mean boiled over? Were there, actual consequences because of this division?
Tragically, yes. Leaders of the Treaty Party Major Ridge, John Ridge, Elias Boudinot, they were assassinated
Wow.
by members of their own tribe who felt they had betrayed the Cherokee people. Only Stan Wadey, another Treaty Party leader, managed to escape that fate.
It really goes to show how deeply the wounds of forced removal cut, tearing apart communities and families. And those scars can last for generations.
They do. And those scars, they weren't just emotional or political either.
Right.
The trauma of the Trail of Tears had a deep impact on Cherokee society as a whole.
Yeah.
Social upheaval, economic hardship, and a tragic loss of cultural knowledge as elders who carried so much tradition died along the way or in the years after removal.
It's just heartbreaking to think about. The loss of their land, the fracturing of their communities, and then the erosion of their cultural heritage on top of it all. It's like a multi-generational attack on their very identity.
And it wasn't just the Cherokee who endured these challenges. The Muskogee, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, each with their own unique cultures and histories, they all had to figure out how to rebuild their lives in a new land, facing similar obstacles.
It's a good reminder that the Trail of Tears wasn't just a single event. It marked the beginning of a whole new struggle for these tribes. A struggle to not just survive physically, but to keep their cultures alive in the face of assimilation.
That's right. The U.S. government, after forcibly removing them, then started a campaign to civilize them, encouraging and in some cases forcing them to adopt European-American customs, language, religion.
A depressingly familiar story, isn't it? Displace a people, take away their land and culture, and then try to mold them into something that fits the dominant society.
Yes, and that's a crucial point. The Trail of Tears wasn't just about the physical journey. It was about this ongoing effort to erase indigenous cultures and absorb them into the dominant one.
So how did the tribes respond to that pressure? Did they just give in?
Oh, not at all. While some individuals or groups did adopt certain European American practices, as a way to survive, many resisted. They held onto their traditions, their languages, their beliefs.
So even in the face of such immense hardship, they found ways to hold on to who they were.
Absolutely. They created their own schools, they taught their languages to their children, they practiced their ceremonies in secret. They found ways to adapt their traditions to a new environment. Their resilience is pretty amazing.
It is.
Hmm.
But their resistance, it wasn't always quiet or hidden, was it? Were there more direct ways they opposed these assimilation policies?
Absolutely. Their resistance took many forms.
Yeah,
Some became politically active, petitioning the government, fighting for recognition of their rights and sovereignty.
right.
Others turned to the courts, seeking some justice for the wrongs they had suffered.
It's incredible to hear how they refused to be silenced.
Hmm.
They were determined to make their voices heard, to fight for the right to control their own destinies.
Yes.
They weren't passive victims in all of this. They were actively resisting oppression in every way they could.
And, they faced huge obstacles and setbacks. But their efforts weren't in vain. They laid the groundwork for the Native American rights movement we saw in the 20th century. Their struggle, their refusal to give up, it resonated through time.
Thinking back on everything we've talked about today, it really hits home that the Trail of Tears wasn't just a journey across land.
No, it
It
wasn't.
was a journey through generations of trauma.
It really was. We often get stuck on the physical hardships, understandably,
Right.
but that emotional and spiritual toll, it can't be ignored.
Absolutely. They weren't just leaving behind homes. They were being ripped away from a way of life, something that had sustained their people for, what, centuries?
Exactly. And a huge part of that way of life was their relationship with the environment.
Right, right.
We're talking about tribes who saw themselves as part of the natural world, not separate from it.
Yeah, they relied on the land for everything.
For food, yes, but also for their culture, their spirituality, their very identity.
So to be removed from their ancestral lands, it wasn't just about losing property.
No, not at
It
all.
was like losing a part of themselves.
Exactly. Imagine having to leave behind the graves of your ancestors, the rivers, the forests that held your stories,
Wow.
the very ground that your people had nurtured for generations.
It's almost like a form of, environmental deprivation.
It is, and we see the effects of that deprivation even now.
Yeah.
Many Native American communities, they're on the front lines of the fight for environmental justice.
Right.
They're working so hard to protect the land and water they have left.
Well, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Having gone through that separation, that loss,
Yeah.
they'd be the most dedicated to protecting what remains.
Exactly. And they come at it from such a unique perspective, a perspective that understands that connection, that interconnectedness of all living things.
It's powerful.
It is. And,
Right.
the Trail of Tears, as tragic as it was, it teaches us how important it is to respect the environment, to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. It's a history that we can all learn from, that can shape how we move forward.
It can. And that's why it's on us to keep this story alive, to make sure those voices from the Trail of Tears are still heard.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners really take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the story doesn't end with the removal.
Right.
It's still being written today.
Oh, yeah.
As Native American communities fight for their rights, their sovereignty, their cultures.
It's a call to action for all of us, isn't it? To do better, to learn, to understand.
It is. And there are so many ways to engage with this history. Educate yourself, visit those historical sites, support Native American-owned businesses,
Right.
but most importantly, listen.
Listen.
Listen to Native American voices, amplify their stories, their struggles, their triumphs.
Couldn't agree more. It's about honoring their experiences, past and present.
Right. By engaging with this history, the good and the bad, we can help make sure the Trail of Tears isn't just a symbol of tragedy,
Yeah.
but that it becomes a catalyst for positive change.
I love that. Well, this has been a powerful deep dive. Heartbreaking, of course, but ultimately, I think, hopeful.
I agree. And I hope it inspires our listeners to keep learning, keep asking questions, keep diving deep.
Until next time, everybody.